What is up, guys? It's BionicTide here, bringing you another tutorial for Diablo 4. If you haven't already seen my other tutorial, it's a much longer, more in-depth tutorial from the beta. Things have changed a little bit from the beta, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will go over a lot of the changes and one big change that I've made to this build. But I will leave that old guide into the description down below. I'll put a link there for you, or maybe even up here on screen. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So there are some big changes that have made this build even better than it was in the beta, and I've tested out a lot of other builds, and really it always comes back to this. I know a lot of people will focus on their abilities and they'll sacrifice all of their skeletons and all of their other stuff with these things, but I'm going to tell you right off bat, it really doesn't work. The best build still uses all these minions, and we'll get into why in just a minute. But again, I said I'm not going to get into too much details on this build. I'm just going to show you what works, not as much of why it works. If you want to see a more in-depth guide, definitely check out my other video there. So let's jump right into it. Main things you want to focus on for equipment in this build is going to be getting extra skeletons, because the more skeletons we have, the more corpses they'll generate, and the more CC they'll apply to the enemies. Then you're going to want to get your barrier skill. Very important. You got to have some form of barrier or you will get thrashed. Barrier just basically adds an entire extra life bar to your character whenever you hit an elite monster, which are going to be the only monsters that give you trouble anyways. And it's really just nice to have a little cushion on your total health there. The next thing you're going to want to focus on is the ranks for your bone spear, your corpse explosion, and the damage for both of those, because they are going to be your main source of damage. So here you'll see I have 2 ranks added to my bone spear. I have ranks added to all my corpse skills, which will include all of the corpse explosions that I'm going to be doing. And there I have more ranks added to the corpse explosions and so forth. Adding ranks to the skills will do a lot more than just adding damage to the skills, because we're going to be multiplying all of the damage, and the ranks bring that cap up even higher. So for the damage, we're going to want to focus mostly on critical hit, and then anytime we can get it, we're going to add vulnerability damage as well, because that's going to amplify a lot of the perks that we're throwing onto our corpse explosion. And same with damage to slowed enemies or stunned enemies as well. And I'll show you why all of that works in a moment here. If you can't get those things though, any type of special perks are always really nice. Things like this that add a blizzard to my skeletons. All of those kind of things are really good. But one thing you will be able to do right away is there's your barrier shield. You can actually unlock a permanent version of that from doing dungeons. And then this one here as well increases the survivability of your skeletons. And it's important that your skeletons survive as much as possible, because we're going to be playing off of them a lot in this build. And since we're talking about them, let's just get right into it and which ones we're using here. So for the warrior skeletons, we're going to be using the Reapers, which we're going to be using the second perk of, because it adds a 15% chance to carve off flesh of enemies, creating a new corpse. And this build relies heavily on having lots of corpses around to detonate, which is really helpful when you're fighting an enemy like a boss that doesn't have a lot of little adds that you can explode, because now you can carve flesh off of him and make corpses with no bodies. You know what I mean? We can just attack a single enemy and make multiple corpses out of it. And then we can use all of those corpses on the enemy. You don't have to kill an enemy to generate corpses. So after that, our next skeleton is going to be, let me close this here, the mages, which are probably one of the most important parts of this build. We're going to get the first perk of the cold mages, and there's 2 reasons we're doing this. One, the cold mages freeze enemies, which again adds to our permanent CC setup. And 2, they're generating more essence, which we are going to use a lot of every time we fire our bone spear. As you can see, it takes a nice little chunk, so if we want to be able to spam it, we need to get as much essence back as possible. And we'll have a few different ways of doing that. The last of our pets is going to be our golem. Very important one here. The blood golem has an ability on his first perk there to take 15% of the damage that you would have taken, which basically adds 15% more mitigation to your character because it all goes to the golem instead of you. And that is very, very handy to have, especially because this guy is so tanky. I don't think he'll ever die on you. I think I've lost maybe one golem the entire time I've played this game. Most scenarios, he'll out-survive you if you're gonna die. That being said, that kind of pretty much wraps up the gear for it there. If you can focus on none of the above, then you should probably focus on essence restoring, like this one here does at the end there, just because, like I said, we're going to be burning through a lot of mana. So the reason we're going to be burning through a lot of mana is our build is extremely damage heavy on these spears. And I'm not going to run through the whole thing from the ground up for you, but I will tell you along the way which ones you can avoid until later. I was originally just going to rebuild the whole thing, but I think it'll be quicker if I just run through it all. So we only want 1 point on bone splinters. We're using this for our mana, I almost called it, our essence regeneration, which is what we use to cast all of our other abilities. And the reason we're going with this one and not one of these other ones I used to use to decompose in the old video is because we're going to be adding a lot of damage to our bone skills later on, and then we can add this perk here, which increases the number of spears we fire and therefore increases the number of essence we get back because more spears are hitting people. So that brings us to our second perk. Again, you only need 1 point in this, and then the first of these perks here. Our second perk here is going to be Bone Spear, and this is our main source of damage in this build. There really is no better skill for damage in the game on Necromancer. Corpse Explosion is probably a little bit better damage over time, and I'll show you why in a little bit here. But for single target, just smashing, most of the time I use this over Corpse Explosion. And on top of it being such good damage, we can also add the enhanced Bone Spear to make it split into 3 spears after it hits the first target, and then we can add Supernatural Bone Spear to make it take advantage of enemies in a different way with our Corpse Explosion later on. But these 3 are all very important to have. Try to max out your Bone Spear as soon as possible, and definitely, even if you only have 1 point on here, definitely get these perks because you are going to want the extra vulnerability that this adds. It is going to be very important later on in the build. You can, if you have the right items on your gear, you probably could do the Paranormal Bone Spear for the crit chance, but it's really not necessary. It's nice because you get extra spears thrown off of it, but you're going to get extra spears thrown anyways with this, and I'll show you how to use those to your advantage. I use this as my primary source of making people vulnerable. On this skill tree, you're also going to want to get Hewed Flesh. You could get it early or get it later, it's up to you, but it is very important because again it adds more corpses to the fray, and the more corpses we can explode, which leads me to our next skill, Corpse Explosion. This is going to be our secondary main damage source. We're going to use this for most of our damage if we're not throwing Bone Spears for the majority of it. And the reason that this can actually eventually outweigh the Bone Spears if you get enough ranks into it is because the cooldown on it is almost non-existent. So if we have a lot of bodies stacked up on each other, we can just detonate all of them back to back. Now, on Corpse Explosion, these perks are very, very, very important. They're actually more important than adding ranks to the skill itself. The first one increases the radius of our Corpse Explosion because it starts off with kind of dog shit radius. The second one is going to be what really adds to the damage pool of this skill. It increases the damage based on whether the enemies are slowed, stunned, or vulnerable, and those bonuses stack between all 3 of them, which is what we will be doing a whole lot of with our next big ability down here. Level up the Skelly Bros when you can. It's not 100% necessary. And Grim Harvest is one that I would put points into right away, because you will need some extra points to get down to where we're going next anyway. Grim Harvest is one I would definitely add points to, but Fueled by Death I would come back for much later in the build. That being said, we're going to skip over this entire tree in the early game. Eventually, you'll come back and add more points for your Skelly Bros because we want, you know, our skeletons as live as long as possible since they're corpse generating for us. But not necessary in the early game. Do it later on at the end of the build. So we're just going to skip over this entirely and come right down here to our other biggest ability in the kit, and that is corpse tendrils. Now it shows that I have 2 points on there, but I actually only have 1 point. The other point comes from my equipment. What you really want is just the first point of this. Like our initial ability, this one only has one purpose, and it's not to do damage, it's to debuff the hell out of our enemies. Not only does it debuff the enemies, but it also CCs them or crowd controls them and debuffs them for our other skill. So when we get this ability by itself, it pulls all the enemies in and makes them get stuck in one spot for a second. Kind of stuns them. Like that. Kind of gross, but great at the same time. Once it pulls the enemies in, these other 2 perks are going to take effect. The first one being that enemies who are in range of the tendrils are slowed by 50%, which means they're now taking slow damage, which is what our corpse plague is amplifying off of. And the second one makes the enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds after they're pulled. So what that'll look like is this: you pull them in, and then you just start exploding, and by God, do they die quick. Next up in the build, we're going to expand that again here. Like I said, this one makes them vulnerable. The more vulnerability we can add to the enemies, the better, because our corpse explosions take advantage of it, but so do our bone spears. Then we're going to scoot down the ladder here. We're not going to touch any of these abilities right away. We're going to come back for them really shortly, but we're not going to touch them right away. What we want to do is get down to Ossified Essence, because this one is going to add massive damage to our bone spears the more essence we have. And because we're constantly generating essence off of our skeletons smashing everything and giving it back to us, we will always have a lot of essence. So our first couple spears we throw in a row are always going to do massive damage on the enemies. And then we can start working our way back up, which would be getting our golem mastery. I would probably get this first, and then going back and getting all of our skeletal masteries, and then coming down here for this tree, where we really wanted to get all of these maxed out. Again, this is on the tree with corpse tendril, and it's Serration, adds more crit chance to our bone spears. Compound Fracture adds more crit damage to our bone spears, and Evulsion adds straight up damage to all of our bone skills every time they critical strike, again multiplying off of this vulnerable enemies. So you can see how these all kind of stockpile and take effect on top of each other, and it comes out really good. Then I would go back up and make sure that you finish out your Fueled by Death, because it's just raw damage every time we use a corpse, which we do quite a lot, and I believe it does stack up to a certain point as well. At that point, at the very, very end of the game, after you've gotten everything else from here, I would come back down here and start adding points into Death's Defense. And once that's maxed out, start adding points back into Bonded Essence. What these do is just further increase the survivability of your skeletons. Death's Defense stops them from getting one-shot by massive attacks. And Bonded in Essence actually means, it sounds like an auto skill, but it's not. Every time you use this ability to summon more skeletons, but you're already at maximum, you can see my skeletons are blizzarding on everybody right It actually heals your skelly bros up. So kind of nice. Every 20 seconds you can get a nice big heal on all your skelly bros. But that's pretty much the gist of the build. I'm not going to go into too much more detail than that. If you want to get more details on the build, you can always check out my old guide and kind of go from there, where I explain every skill in depth and what it does. For now, let's just jump into the actual combo, and then I'm going to show you some gameplay of how we can really utilize that against massive crowds or big boss targets. But let's just jump right into it. The ideal method for the combo, you're going to want to corpse tendril everything in and then explode on it while it's being pulled in, because you have all those effects being applied to it with your corpse explosion. Once the enemy is no longer kind of debuffed and stunned from the corpse tendrils, then you're going to want to send in your golem. And this is, again, another reason why it's not good to sacrifice your golem. He is really a great sacrifice to get this 30% critical damage, but he is so much better to keep on your team. And I know I don't have an ultimate ability, but that's because the ultimate abilities for Necromancer kind of suck, and I'd rather have a skeleton army and a golem. And I'll show you what that does. The golem is actually your second form of CC. So your first form of crowd control is the corpse tendril itself, which again pulls all the enemies in and then stuns them for quite a while, so you can kind of explode for quite a bit after that. And then once they're no longer stunned, you're going to throw your big boy at it by re-summoning him again to that target. And he will AoE and pull all of the monster's aggression towards himself, kind of acting like another stun, keeping the enemy CC'd. And then while that's happening, you can start chucking bone spears at them to add the vulnerable effect again, since you're not using corpse tendril. Use the bone spear to add the vulnerability back to the enemy and start exploding them all again. Or you could just keep chucking bone spears. They both do really good damage. It's all about your playstyle and what you like to do. I personally like to go kind of bone spear, explode, explode, bone spear, explode, explode, just so that I'm keeping them vulnerable and doing lots of damage. But that's it. That's pretty much the whole combo. You can left click occasionally if you're out of mana, but for whatever reason you don't have your skeletal mages generating tons of mana for you. That's always a good method to get it back, but not really something I actually use very often at all. My skeletal mages are plenty good at generating mana on top of all my other mana regen perks. That is pretty much it, guys. I will show you some gameplay on how that works, and if you want, as a little bonus treat, I can even show you some great ways to level up and get to that max build points right away. But here, let's just jump right into it. We're going to jump right into this cave over here, and I'll show you how quickly this build can rough up crowds of people. I don't want to make a super long video like last time, so I'm just going to give you some quick examples. This build has carried me all the way into Nightmare very, very easily, comparing to all the other builds that I see on YouTube's. And I wouldn't change any part of it. I really wouldn't. It all works really well together. The vulnerability and slow that the corpse tendrils are adding is way better than the decrepify we had on our old build. But it is just too good. I wouldn't change it. So again, you're seeing that these skeletons are also freezing these enemies. We're getting the barrier from hitting a big guy. All the big guy's already dead. The boss is already dead. That quick. All the enemies are dead. It's that easy, guys. It's really that easy. And I'm pretty under geared at the moment for my level, because all the enemies scale on your level. And I'm using pretty old equipment. And I will share my PvP build right after this, but first let's take a look at this build in some PvE clips.
DJ, spin that shit!
and for PvP, it will work all right, but there's a better way to do it, and that is to get rid of all of your skeletons. So we're going to get rid of every single blue node here, and I think the other ones were down here, and these two as well. We're going to get rid of all of our blue nodes, and we're going to get this standalone and Memento Mori, which increases the bonus of sacrificing our skeletons by 60%. And what we're going to do then, because we're not summoning golems or skeletons anymore, we're going to get this, the Bone Storm full tree, because that's going to be replacing one of our skeleton summons, and the Blood Mist full tree, just 1 point in each, because we want to leave corpses behind to burst on people. And that's it. That's the whole PvP build. You get rid of every blue icon that you have, and you replace them with these two here and this. Then you can get 1 point in each of these. That's our whole PvP build. So now we're going to use Corpse Explosion, Blood Mist, Corpse Tendrils, and Bone Storm. And the goal is to Corpse Tendril and Corpse Explosion and Bone Spear everybody that we can. And if they start to get a leg up, we're going to pop our Blood Mist and our Bone Storm together so that we'll be invincible underground and kind of a spiral of spinning death around them. So let's go try it out.
Of essence.
And there you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed. Definitely like and subscribe and all of that bullshit. I will see you on the next one.